Good morning, everyone. Hope everyone is having a wonderful day. We've been really busy, but I want to thank everybody for your cards and phone calls and emails and comments underneath our videos. We really appreciate it very much. Oh, and the messages on Twitter and stuff like that. So I want to cover a few things. And the first thing I want to cover is I want to thank Sharon, my friend Sharon, very much for sending me the link to this newspaper article like 100 years ago, maybe even a little bit more than 100 years ago, that kind of started me down this rabbit hole of doing some research. And I found a bunch of other stuff also. But I want to start with the Encyclopedia of Arkansas here in the United States under Jehovah's Witnesses. And I'll put the links down below to all of this so that you can, because a lot of this stuff is really interesting, especially those of us who were in the Jehovah's Witnesses and know how they feel about going to war and neutrality.
But now for the rest of our update, I'd like to speak with you about an important topic: the need to remain focused on God's kingdom as the real solution to mankind's problems. This vital truth helps us to stay neutral regarding the world's political issues.
And all of that. And I had no idea this is what was going on. And I think a lot of us, we have no clue of what happened in Watchtower's history. And I know it's been a while since we've done anything about Watchtower's history, but I really felt like, I had to get this information and share it with everybody. Jehovah's Witnesses. Since early in its history, the religious movement known as Jehovah's Witnesses or the Watchtower Bible Tract Society has been represented in Arkansas. As of 2009, Arkansas has 110 English-speaking and 24 Spanish-speaking congregations of Jehovah's Witnesses, with a total membership estimated at 10,000 adherents. And it goes on to tell a little bit about the Jehovah's Witnesses, like the origin of Jehovah's Witnesses is closely tied to the work of C.T. Russell, who was strongly influenced by the Adventist movement in the United States in the 19th century. He concluded that most Christian churches were in a state of apostasy, rejecting the teachings of Jesus in the Bible and replacing them with invented doctrines. Russell predicted the dramatic end to history was coming in the year 1914, when World War I began in Europe that year. Russell believed that the period of history that he called the Gentile times had come to an end. We all know this. Then it goes on to talk about after Russell's death, Rutherford, came into power. Now this is what was interesting. I'm going to scroll down. During World War I, followers of Russell refused to serve in the U.S. Armed Forces, even when they were drafted. On April 29, 1918, 5 followers of Russell were jailed in Walnut Ridge, Lawrence County, because of their resistance to the war effort. That's what Jehovah's Witnesses do. And we heard stories from the old-timers in our old congregations about how they went to prison even during World War II because they were not going to, do the draft. Identified as W.B. Duncan, Edward French, Charles Frank, Mr. Griffin, and Mrs. D. Van Hosen, these 5 were assaulted in jail by an angry mob and were whipped, tarred, and feathered and driven from town. And we know Watchtower, they play into this, that they're the victims and religious persecution and hatred and all of that. We've been hearing this our entire lives. Now this is where it gets interesting. In July of the same year, 8 followers of Russell were the subject of an intense manhunt known as the Cleburne County Draft War. This incident began on July 6 when Sheriff Jasper Duke and 4 other men attempted to serve a warrant on Bliss Addison for his failure to report when drafted for military service. Okay, so this is the sheriff and his deputies going to serve a warrant for Atkinson. Gunshots were exchanged at the Atkinson farm. Gunshots. What the heck happened? Reports are inconsistent about who fired the first shot, fatally wounding Porter Hazelwood, one of the men who had accompanied the sheriff. So one of the members of the posse was shot. Bliss, along with his father Tom and his brother Hardy, fled and hid in the woods. The following day, July 7th, Duke returned with 25 men and more gunfire was exchanged. Up to 200 government officials and volunteers, including 30 members of the 4th Arkansas Infantry National Guard, searched the area for these men and for others reputed to be hiding with them and planning an armed assault on the community. 2 machine guns were brought up from Little Rock in anticipation of the fight. Houston Osborne, the Russelite preacher, was jailed along with his family on suspicion of encouraging and assisting in the revolt. Eventually, the Atkinsons and others with them turned themselves in to the authorities without further bloodshed. Okay, now it's talking about Jehovah's Witnesses and even one of the Russelite preachers. They were not going to be drafted. They were not going to fight in the war. But yet, they shoot and kill one of the men that were coming to serve the warrant on them. And you got to scratch your head on this. Jehovah's Witnesses won't go to war and fight to defend their country, and they claim they're totally neutral, but yet their members back at this time, to avoid being drafted, are shooting at the sheriff and his posse. It doesn't make sense, does it? But it goes on, and it gets interesting. World War II led to further conflict between Jehovah's Witnesses and their neighbors. Because of their refusal to salute the flag or to serve in the armed forces, Jehovah's Witnesses were beaten, jailed, or both. W.M. Manning was arrested in Texarkana and convicted on charges of desecrating the flag and distributing un-American literature. How's that being neutral? He received the maximum sentence of 30 days in jail and $100 fine in spite of a letter from J. Edgar Hoover, director of the FBI, saying that the Jehovah's Witnesses had no connection with the Nazis or any other un-American group. In June 1941, Joe Johnson was convicted of showing public contempt for the flag in Marshall County because he had refused to pledge allegiance to the flag as a condition of receiving his monthly welfare allowance. A year later, the Arkansas State Supreme Court sustained his sentence. See, we've heard the sanitized version of this from Jehovah's Witnesses, from Watchtower directly. But how many of us have actually gone and heard the other side of, this story? And it just goes on to talk about, violence against Jehovah's Witnesses and, all of this that was going on. Now, I'm going to go to this newspaper article, Arkansas Democrat Gazette. Religious rights. Jehovah's Witnesses still face discrimination. 100 years ago today, April 29, 1918, 5 followers of the late Charles T. Russell, the founder of what would become known as Jehovah's Witnesses, were jailed in the northeast Arkansas city of Walnut Ridge because of their opposition to American involvement in World War I. A mob later attacked the 4 men and 1 woman while still in jail, whipped them, tarred and feathered them, and then drove them out of town. To our lasting shame, this brutal action in Walnut Ridge was merely one example of many instances when Arkansans took extraordinary means to silence opposition to the World War. We've heard this. Jehovah's Witnesses were the victims of a lot of, attacks, mob attacks and stuff back then. Now, when you skip down, it says the best known of these violent encounters occurred in rural area east of Quitman in the rolling hills of southern Cleburne County. Among the farmers living in the area was Tom Atkinson, whose son Bliss had refused to report for military induction. Atkinson was a member of the Bible student movement founded by Charles Russell in the late 1870s. This movement evolved into the Watchtower Society and in 1931 became known as the Jehovah's Witnesses. Among Russell's teachings was a strict condemnation of military service. Indeed, the sect prohibited participation in governmental affairs altogether. On Saturday, July 6, 1918, the sheriff of Cleburne County and a posse of 4 made a sweep through the southern part of the county in search of draft evaders and deserters. Their efforts came up empty-handed until later that night when they reached the home of Tom Atkinson. A gunfight resulted in the wounding of a posse member, whereupon the sheriff and his men abandoned the encounter and left the wounded man behind. Atkinson asked a neighbor to evacuate the wounded posse member, but he died nonetheless. A later battle resulted in no deaths, but it prompted the governor to send 30 guardsmen, who interestingly left Little Rock and 6 Cadillacs plus 2 Vickers machine guns stowed in the cars. Fortunately, the Russellites had left the area and eventually they surrendered. Both Tom and Bliss Atkinson were sentenced to time in the state prison. Bliss Atkinson did not live to finish his prison term as he was killed by an armed prisoner during a prison break. I would like to report that Arkansans developed a greater sensitivity to the constitutional rights of Jehovah's Witnesses by the time World War II erupted. But while violence seems to have declined, harassment of witnesses continued, and sometimes it was the children who suffered the most. All right, now I am going to go. There was a newspaper article in the Log Cabin Democrat, Thursday, March 11th, 1920, page 4. Legion censors stay to Atkinson. Arkansas Gazette, March 11th. It's like a scan of the old newspaper, so it's kind of hard to read. Looks like Heber Springs. The Saxton Willis Post of the American Legion last night adopted resolutions condemning the action of Governor Burrow in granting stays of sentences to Tom Atkinson and his son Bliss Atkinson, alleged slayers of Porter Hazelwood. Yeah, these are good Jehovah's Witnesses who shot and ended up killing this member of the posse. Hazelwood was killed July 7, 1918, when he accompanied the sheriff of Cleburne County to the Atkinson home to arrest Bliss Atkinson and his brother-in-law Leo Martin on charges of resisting the draft. The resolutions charged that Governor Burrow did not make a thorough investigation of the cases and that residents of Cleburne County were not consulted. The governor's statement to the newspapers that the stays were granted to permit the Atkinsons to plant a crop is declared untrue. As the Legionnaires here say, they have been informed that they have not raised a crop for several years. The action Governor Burrow has taken and the statements he has made for the press are, in our opinion, in utter disregard for the wishes of the people of the county where the crime was committed. Yeah. Bliss is in prison for killing that posse member. But you can go on to read it because this stay was actually, it calls it a stay of execution. So, yeah. But like I said, when you start reading this stuff, it's like, oh my goodness. Here's another article from the Northwest Arkansas Democrat Gazette. Draft Wars. Rural Arkansans opposed to military induction fought against the power of state and national law. Yeah, they were heavily armed. Okay, it goes on to talk about World War I and how conflicts broke out in remote stretches of northern and western Arkansas. Now labeled as draft wars, these 5 mainly rural encounters pitted variously motivated foes of military induction against forces of law and order. Little known today, the clashes took place during a hyper-patriotic time in U.S. history, as sauerkraut became victory cabbage and the Bill of Rights was defiled to prosecute and sometimes persecute public dissent. And you can go on to read this. They talk about, how it was very patriotic at that time in these states. And you can read, about how patriotic this state was back during this time. But I'm going to skip about halfway through. The July 7th to the 16th Cleburne County War, which logged more newspaper coverage than the others, was distinctive in that the registers had a professed religious motive. Now remember, they were called Russellites prior to Jehovah's Witnesses, but that's what they were. And they're supposed to be peace-loving, neutral people. They were Russellites, known since 1931 as Jehovah's Witnesses, fully opposed to war. One of their publications asserted that men who fought in World War I would be damned to hell. The tract labeled wars of patriotism and nationalism as narrow-minded hatred of other people. But the Russellites evidently did believe in armed self-defense. No, they weren't supposed to. During the first arrest attempt at member Tom Atkinson's home 10 miles from Heber Springs, a posse member was fatally shot. 8 Russellites then took to the woods, where eventually more than 200 armed men were mobilized to round them up. 2 Vickers machine guns were even brought into play. Although he had admitted to the killing, Tom Atkinson was convicted only of voluntary manslaughter. His son Bliss got 20 years in prison for second-degree murder. See, even back then, these are not peace-loving Christians, and they may have been trying to avoid going to war, but how is this any different? You don't want to go to war and kill anybody, but yet you're killing the posse members who are coming to arrest you for draft evasion? Oh, like I said, you can go on to read this. It talks about, not only Jehovah's Witnesses, but there was other very patriotic people who were evading the draft. There's another one here, Encyclopedia of Arkansas, the Cleburne County Draft War. The Cleburne County Draft War was one of 3 violent encounters in World War I era Arkansas that occurred in the spring and summer of 1918 between local officials determined to enforce the Selective Service Act of 1917 and citizens who resisted conscription. In this episode, those resisting the draft were Jehovah's Witnesses, then known as Russellites, who were widely viewed with suspicion and hatred because of the refusal to take part in civic and military affairs. And then it goes on to talk about, the sheriff and 4 posse members in search of delinquents who had not registered for the draft. 5-man posse zeroed in on the home of Tom Atkinson, whose son Bliss had been delinquent since October, and a shootout ensued that left posse member Porter Hazelwood dead. Duke fled with his remaining men to Heber Springs, where he gathered some 25 men and more guns and returned to the Atkinson home. In the interim, Tom Atkinson recruited other area deserters and delinquents who stationed themselves in or around the house, and after a 45-minute battle, the gang of resistors fled, setting fire to the underbrush to make pursuit impossible. Oh my goodness. Then, it just goes on to tell the same thing, that they had fled. Later that afternoon, the band in pursuit of the resistors had grown to more than 100 men, including the sheriffs of White and Faulkner counties, the Searcy Home Guard, and volunteers from across the region. Bloodhounds were brought in from Conway to help in the pursuit. As the posse got to work, rumors emerged in Heber Springs that the Atkinson clan intended to attack the town. These are Russellites. Oh my goodness. Then the National Guard, it's the same story as before. The National Guard was brought in. Houston Osborne, a Russelite preacher, and his family were all placed in jail for supposedly instigating the resistance. Russelite preacher instigating the resistance, while friends and family of the outlaws were interned in Heber Springs Edwards Hotel to prevent them from aiding the gang. There they lived in fear of being lynched or burned to death. The rest of the week proceeded rather anticlimactically. On July 10th, a search of the Atkinson home turned up large amounts of food and ammunition. Searchers also found a copy of Charles Taze Russell's The Finished Mystery, which had been published posthumously in 1917 and quickly suppressed by federal authorities because of its denigration of governments that demand of peace-loving men the sacrifice of themselves and their loved ones and the butchery of their fellows, and hail it as a duty demanded by the law of heaven. Subversive literature was added to the list of things that raiders sought, and the next day George Burleson and his son were arrested for carrying a copy of The Finished Mystery. Judge Rutherford, then leader of the Russellites, and 7 of his associates had been arrested earlier that year and sentenced to 20 years in federal prison for their part in publishing and distributing the book. On Saturday, July 13th, the 4th Arkansas Infantry returned to Little Rock. That day, Leo Martin, one of Tom Atkinson's sons-in-law, surrendered himself in White County. The next day, 4 more members of the group surrendered at Rosebud. The Atkinsons turned themselves in during the next 2 days. Like their fellow resistors, they surrendered outside of Cleburne County. In addition to crimes relating to their resisting the draft, Tom and Bliss Atkinson were charged with the murder of Porter Hazelwood. Despite his admission of killing the man to protect his son, Tom was convicted only of voluntary manslaughter, while Bliss was found guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced to 25 years in prison. Bliss was killed by notorious bank robber Tom Slaughter in 1921, while Slaughter was attempting a prison break. Oh, interesting stuff, right? Like I said, we hear Watchtower side of it, but we don't hear the other side, like what's in the newspapers. And I had never heard that these draft dodgers, these Russellites, had actually shot and killed a posse member that was coming to arrest them. So I'll put the links down below to all of that. Thank you so much, guys, for joining me. And I want to thank Katina for sending me the links to this. The Dallas Observer. Texas lawmakers look to crack down on CSA abusers. And it's interesting because the Gateway Church now, which is one of those mega churches in Texas, they are being rocked with allegations and, CSA problems. And Texas lawmakers are looking now. Yeah, I'll just read the first couple of paragraphs. In the wake of a CSA abuse allegations against Southlake megachurch minister Robert Morris, state representatives are speaking out against the laws that they believe allow child abuse enablers to go unpunished. Morris founded the Gateway Church in 2000 and resigned from his prominent position last week after a woman, Cindy Clemishire, detailed sexual abuse that she says took place beginning in 1982 when she was 12 years old. I'm not going to go into the details, but there was a lot of allegations and the founder of the megachurch stepped down. But Texas lawmakers are now looking at the clergy penitent privilege and to crack down on this. And I think all of the states need to do this. And the thing is they all need to be mandatory reporters, and they need to get rid of that clergy penitent privilege where it is a secret or kept confidential. No, I think the clergy also needs to report these CSA cases. Now, she also sent me this from the Christian Today magazine. I'll put the link down below. All churches should require background checks. I wholeheartedly agree with that. Anyone who is going to be in a position should have a background check. I think all elders need background checks. And I know that Jehovah's Witnesses, a lot of them would have a clean background and it wouldn't come up as them being a predator because they've been hiding it and they just move them around. So, it sounds like a good thing, but in reality, a lot are going to slip through the cracks, especially Jehovah's Witnesses, because that's what they do. That's what the Catholic Church did for years, is just move these priests around, and they didn't report it. So even if you did a background check on them, it's going to come up clean. The Presbyterian Church in America voted not to require background checks on church leaders. Why? What are they trying to hide? Right? Yeah. So I'll put the link down below to this. It goes on to talk, about the problem they have, and like I mentioned, it sounds good in black and white, but technically, actuality, yeah, some are going to slip through the cracks. So thank you so much, everybody, for watching. Bye.